Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
Many veterans are being denied critical benefits due to inconsistent and delayed discharge upgrade decisions. A new GAO report reveals that military review boards often fail to apply guidance meant to support veterans with PTSD or military sexual trauma. Here to explain the impacts of those systemic shortcomings and how DoD could fix them is Director in GAO's Defense Capabilities and Management Team, Christy Williams. Ms. Williams, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's good to be here.
You have published a very important report on Department of Defense considerations for military discharge actions. Having said that, though, I want to back up and have you start at the beginning. What is the issue at stake in this latest report?
So let me start with a basic answer, and I'll try to be brief here, but service members fundamentally can receive several types of discharge. This can range from honorable to dishonorable, and those who engage in different types of misconduct, so think things like drug use, not reporting for duty, or maybe even more severe misconduct like violence or fraud, they can be separated without an honorable discharge. That is important because individuals who are separated without that honorable discharge, they may have trouble accessing some important benefits, think education and medical benefits, and may even have some challenges getting jobs. If you receive the honorable discharge, you are eligible for all Department of Veterans Affairs benefits, but that changes as the discharge characterization changes. So we were looking at the post-separation review boards. Basically, they provide veterans who are separated without that honorable discharge the opportunity to apply, have their board consider whether their characterization should be upgraded, which could then lead to differences in the benefits that they receive.
And this reconsideration, especially more recently, is, I think, a response to some mischaracterizations as a result of wartime experience or other sorts of negative experiences that may have a connection then to mental health. Is that correct?
Absolutely. So if you go back to kind of what liberal consideration is and the foundation for it, it's helpful to think about it from a series of memos driven by a lawsuit back in 2014, where a group of Vietnam veterans, they filed this lawsuit against the military services. And their claim was that they had PTSD before it was a recognized condition. That led to their being discharged without that honorable characterization. So in response to that, DoD issued a series of memos. The first was in 2014. Then Secretary of Defense Hagel issued a memo that basically was acknowledging, hey, PTSD was not a recognized mental health diagnosis at the time of service for Vietnam. So the records may not reflect the information needed for those discharge characterizations. That memo then directed, so there are various levels of boards. That memo directed the boards for correction of military records to give liberal consideration to applications that considered PTSD, so think mental health conditions like PTSD, traumatic brain injury, but also military sexual misconduct. That was then enforced a little more strongly in 2017 when the acting Undersecretary of Defense issued the CURTA memo, which basically expanded that DoD guidance to include the discharge review boards, which is that first line where individuals would apply.
And so now, as you did the assessment, tell us what you found.
So we had 4 key findings in our report. They were really focused on issues surrounding guidance that was offered, timeframes, communication, and the availability of information. So breaking that down, if I can quickly, from a guidance perspective, we did find that the boards inconsistently applied some of the key guidance, some of those provisions in the CURTA memo, on evidence needed to support cases involving liberal consideration. So think, for example, the CURTA memo had some guidance on whether the VA determination of a service-connected mental health condition, while it is not binding, is persuasive enough evidence to consider that the condition existed. There is also a requirement for testimony in sexual misconduct, so think sexual assault, sexual harassment cases, where the testimony alone may establish the existence of a condition. And the challenge is that the military services gave different weight to both of these different levels of guidance. Some gave more benefit of the doubt, while others were less likely to accept, the testimony or the VA service connection without some additional documentation. Fast forward a little bit, timeframes was a big issue in the sense that the boards for correction of military records have statutory timeframes by which they are to adjudicate cases. The other boards do not. They have estimates that they published, and those estimates were inconsistently met. They're also not consistently communicating those adjudication timeframes, those estimates to the individuals, which could present a challenge in what the individual is taking from it and the information that is communicated to them. Communication was also another issue that we found some challenges with. Really, the explanation of liberal consideration guidance and how that factored into the decisions. So that CURTA memo basically had 4 key questions that boards are to consider when applying liberal consideration, and those answers can form the basis of a decision. But the challenge was the information from the CURTA memo was inconsistent in some of these decisions, and also the information that is to be posted in a public reading room, that information wasn't always available, and we found about 43% of the documents from closed cases was not available, and the information wasn't in an easy-to-find format.
I'm speaking with Christy Williams. She's a director in GAO's Defense Capabilities and Management team. So before we move on to the recommendations, I just want to go back for a minute on these findings. Was there a difference across the military departments? There's quite a difference in the number of cases across the departments. Was there a difference in the procedure?
So there was in a number of areas. So first, when you think about the guidance, the Army, for example, gave the benefit of the doubt in some cases to a VA service connection or a testimony in a military sexual trauma case. The Navy, in those cases, sometimes required some additional documentation, and the Air Force was less likely to grant the upgrade in some cases. We also looked at the outcomes, whether a discharge was fully granted, partially granted, or not granted. And we have a graphic in the report that really depicts this by board, and you can definitely see some differences in the grant rates. The Army boards were more likely to fully grant as opposed to some of the Air Force boards in the overall rates of the various boards that were considering the applications. And then I just want to talk a little bit, if I can, about timeframes, because there are various estimates in terms of when these cases will be adjudicated within. So the Army might say it could take up to 12 months. The Navy's average was around 8 months, and the Air Force ranged between 4 to 8 months. And those timeframes were sometimes met, and sometimes they were not. I will say our timeframe for analysis was 2018 to the first quarter of 2024. And we chose that time because the CURTA memo was signed in 2017, and it had 45 days to implement. So we wanted to make sure that there was enough time to implement the guidance before looking at the data. So we did see some inconsistencies across the information that was either shared or considered in the adjudication of cases.
So those findings are really important because they get at the core of what any individual service member who's trying to get their case reexamined could expect. And these are so important and so personal. Talk to us then about your recommendations for improvement of this process.
Absolutely. So we had 9 recommendations. 6 of those recommendations were directed to the Office of the Secretary of Defense. The Undersecretary of Defense for Personnel and Readiness is largely responsible for oversight and ensuring uniformity in this process. And then we had a recommendation to each of the military departments. The department did concur and partially concurred with some of our recommendations. So, for example, with our findings related to guidance, we had recommendations on really developing a process to monitor the board's review of the cases and then really the consistent application of liberal consideration guidance. We got a partial concur and a full concur on those 2 recommendations. And I will say the partial was largely driven by the fact that we did suggest in monitoring the board's guidance and ensuring consistency that there could be value in considering a joint service review board just to inject some of that consistency across. DoD said it was a little premature to consider that board. They believe that doing that would kind of contravene with the military department's statutory authority to correct the military records. So the joint board, I think, was really what was driving the partial concur there. We did get some non-concurs in our recommendations focused on timeframes, and we had 2 recommendations, or 2 bodies of recommendations, I should say here. The first was that DoD develop required adjudication timeframes for the certain boards that didn't have them, so the Discharge Review Board and the Discharge Appeal Review Board. DOD's position was that the Undersecretary of Defense for Personnel and Readiness didn't really believe that adjudication timeframes beyond those assigned by Congress fell within their responsibilities. They said that the flexibility is needed in the process, particularly since January 2025. There have been personnel decreases, there have been some additional tasks levied on these boards, and it could really complicate their ability to adjudicate cases within timeframes. We then had recommendations to the military services that they ensure that the boards regularly update those estimated adjudication timeframes that I mentioned. Again, this was an area where the department did not concur with us. Their suggestion was that the estimated timeframes are based on historical averages, and that really differs a little bit from what we found during our review. So, for example, the Army said they were unsure how their estimated time frame was determined. They said it was likely determined prior to the implementation of liberal consideration in 2014. So we do feel that the reestablishment, the recalculation of those estimated timeframes could really provide some benefit to the individuals that are applying, give them a sense of what they can expect in the process, especially since those timeframes, we recognize they will vary. We recognize there are circumstances that will impact it, but it'll give that individual time to really know, in which, because quite frankly, and going back to a conversation we had at the beginning, benefits could potentially be factored in here. And some of these people could benefit from having the medical, the education benefits afforded under that honorable discharge. With regard to communication, we had a recommendation on including explicit answers, and I think this one is important, to the CURTA memo's 4 questions when providing information to the individuals. DOD's position is that CURTA memo says that requests will typically involve the 4 questions, and they are not required and were never intended to be. And we acknowledge that the guidance does not explicitly require the boards to address those questions. However, we think that given that the intent of the memo was to ensure greater uniformity amongst the boards and to ensure the fair and consistent standards of review, that it would be valuable to consider those 4 questions in each case. And over the course of our review and conversations with DOD officials, they did acknowledge that inconsistencies in the level of detail in some of these documents, it has been an issue. And they, at one point in our conversations, did indicate that they were exploring ways to enhance consistency in those documents, such as requiring the responses to those CURTA memos 4 questions. So we think that would really improve transparency in the process.
Just to wrap up, this report was directed by Congress. You got an unusually large number of non-concurrers from DOD here. What do you think will happen next?
So I'll be honest, our report was issued just prior to the August recess. So in terms of direct follow-up with the clients, we haven't gotten to that point yet. But I will say from a recommendation follow-up perspective, we value and appreciate the department's comments and their perspectives. And we had a chance in our report in the response to agency comments to provide our thoughts and our responses to their non-concurs. Our hope is that action will still be taken. There is value for individual service members, veterans, to understand the process, to have consistency in the process, and to know in what time frame they will be hearing information. So we will continue to follow up on these recommendations, including non-concurs. There have been cases in the past where action is taken that impacts a recommendation that DOD non-concurred on. So for us internally, this will be a regular process. We will update these recommendations and continue to work with the department on actions they plan to take.
I've been speaking with Christy Williams. She's a director in GAO's Defense Capabilities and Management Team. Thank you so much for bringing this report to our attention.
Thank you for your time. I appreciate it.
We'll post this interview and a link to the report at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts.